Hey, nonprofit friends. I'm Tosha Anderson, the host of a modern nonprofit podcast. I'm going to be having a solo conversation today about an interesting conversation that I had just this week with an existing client of mine. And we're talking about restricted grants. And we're talking about restricted grants and how sometimes they help us, sometimes they hurt us, and why we should be releasing the restrictions on those grants as quickly as possible. So I'm going to try to not make this too much into the accounting or financial compliance speak, but also just from a practical fundraising best practice, how to structure these grants and a way to best serve your organization. I think a lot of times we might be motivated to write grants that are restricted for a particular purpose because maybe they are more desirable to the funder. Maybe there's certain priority areas that the funder is wanting us to apply for, and that sounds all great. But I want to give some examples of how, in some cases, I've witnessed restricted grants actually hurting organizations. So we're going to kind of go through that. But before we dive in, I'm not going to assume that everybody understands the difference between restricted and unrestricted. Some of us are not always from the fundraising or the accounting background within an organization. And very simply, a restricted grant, a restricted fund, they call that, is money given to a nonprofit organization, and it's designated by the donor specifically for a purpose. Usually it's a time period for which you have to spend it, or it could be related to a specific program, for example. An unrestricted grant is really what we call kind of general operating, or a grant or a foundation, or, I'm sorry, a funder or like a foundation could maybe give that to you just for, general support, really no strings attached. They might want to report on how you ultimately spend it or what impact it might have, but they're not really restricting it for any of the particular purpose. And also worth noting that even if we in our heads as leaders of nonprofits want to earmark certain dollars for certain things, but the donor does not necessarily make these restrictions on that gift, that is still considered an unrestricted gift, even if our board creates what they call like a quasi endowment or board restricted assets or things like that, right? So that's about as much of the jargon I think I'm going to try to get into right now. But know that the more sophisticated a nonprofit organization gets, whether it's in their age, maturity, or they're just like funding complexity, oftentimes restricted grants become more and more of a thing, right? And we're going to talk about where some of these are a problem and where they're not a problem. But let's start with where they're beneficial, where it's actually not a problem to get restricted grants. The reality is, if you're getting restricted grants for programs that you've already been administering and you've already identified some sort of fundraising gap, in other words, it's expenses that you know that you're already going to spend with or without the recipient of this restricted grant, that's great. That's raising money for expenses we already know that we're going to be spending. So if they're core programs that you already deliver, it's super easy alignment. And I think restricted grants can be really great. If your team is really great at tracking grants, or you have the infrastructure in place to be able to identify which costs or which, or how to allocate those costs, that's also really easy. And you can separate those costs and you can report on them, with relative ease. If your infrastructure is already set up that way, I think restricted grants are perfectly fine, right? And here's something that interesting that I don't think people realize. If set up the right way, your systems that are designed to track all these restricted grants are scalable. So if you, in theory, could track 1 or 2 or 3 grants, you should be able to track potentially 10 or 20, right? So hopefully your organization, if you are setting up systems to track restricted grants, that you're doing so in a way that's scalable. Okay, what are some other ways that they might be a good idea? If your funding cycle matches the grant cycle or your program cycle, if all of the timing is well aligned and you have minimal cash outflow or cash flow stress, that might be a good thing, right? If, for example, you are receiving a grant award, but you have to deliver that service or expend those dollars in one particular year, but you're not going to get reimbursed until the future, that might put you in a cash flow crunch. And if that is a problem for your organization and you don't have the cash balance to weather that timing difference, or if the time when you're awarded and you have to deliver the services and when you receive the money is too challenging for your organization, it may not make sense to move forward with that grant. And deliver those services in that way. And last but not least, if your donors or funders are very clear about their expectations or what they're looking for in terms of reporting out, and you feel confident that you can measure whatever that might be, this might be outcomes, impact, it might be individuals served, how you have made a difference in their lives, not only just how you spent the money on the dollars and the cents, but also what impact did that have? If that's something that your organization feels pretty confident it can report out, then it probably makes sense to go after restricted grants. So those are a lot of good, I think, arguments for why restricted grant writing makes sense for your organization. But let's talk about some of the unintended consequences or situations for which I've seen maybe restricted grants do not make sense. I've already given examples of cash flow challenges. So in other words, when you are delivering the services that are in line with the grant, but you can't access those dollars for a future period of time, that could be really problematic. And sometimes there's a misalignment on the grant might pay you in milestones, whether it's every quarter or you achieve certain milestones along the progress of your organization, but maybe you as the nonprofit, you have to hire team members in advance of the grant for which maybe you can't get reimbursed, or maybe you're not going to be reimbursed for a great deal of time. I see this very often in the case if you are doing any sort of federal grants where there's drawdowns, you could be looking at somewhere between 30, 45, 60, maybe even 90 days for which your organization is incurring the cost of administering that program, but you're not getting reimbursed. And sometimes, depending on how the grants are structured, especially if it's in a pilot program, or there's certain milestones programmatically that you have to achieve in order to get paid, that could be really problematic because if it's a program that you've not proven the concept yet, you may not meet those milestones. And does that make a difference for whether or not you're going to get reimbursed for the cost that you've already absorbed? So read the fine print pretty clearly and make sure you understand what are the timing differences potentially between cash outflow, money that your organization is paying, likely its staff, and when you're expected to get those dollars back. All right. Another one I often see is just mission drift. I said before, it makes absolute sense for you to go after restricted grants if those grants are already in line with the core programs that you already offer. Or if that restricted grant is in line with the strategic plan that maybe you already have spelled out. Maybe you're not doing that program yet, but you know it's something that your organization and your board are trying to get into at some point in the future. Where I've seen this become a problem when a nonprofit identifies that there could be a funding source available and there's a grant application and the programs that they're prioritizing or the initiatives that they want to fund are mission adjacent, maybe, right? And then you start creating new programs or subsets of programs, or you're combining elements of programs, or maybe you're just going all the way out in left field and you're coming up with some new concept or new program. I see that happen, and we call that mission drift. Right? If you're going out and getting restricted grants that are not really core to who you are, it's a bit of a pilot project and it's kind of an impromptu thing that wasn't necessarily vetted or maybe thought through with a particular funder, it might be a problem for your organization. It just doesn't fit the strategy and it may not be something you want to do long term. And asking yourself, really, is this just a means to get money in the door? And I see this happen a lot of times. I've worked with clients before where they would just write grants that I think look appealing to a particular funder, maybe to get the funding in the door. The work that they're doing is not really core to their mission. And I think it would, it's safe to say that it might be considered a mission drift. The problem with this is that oftentimes when you write these types of grants, because you don't already have something in place to support the execution of that grant. It's, for example, if you have $10,000 and you decide you want to go plant an urban garden, for example, and you are an organization that maybe you have, I'm coming up with an example off the top of my head, maybe you are a homeless shelter and you decide to do an urban garden down the street around the corner. That might sound great. And I could see where that's programmatic adjacent. Maybe it's a food source, maybe it's building skills, maybe it's therapeutic in some way. I could see the case there. The problem is oftentimes we think, oh, we're going to write the grant for $10,000. So we're going to get $10,000 in the door. That's great. But if that $10,000 is now generating additional costs that you would not have otherwise incurred, maybe you have to build out the garden, maybe you have to buy the supplies, maybe you need to hire a part-time person to teach gardening classes, for example. Are these going to be additional costs that your organization now has to bear the brunt of those? That they wouldn't have otherwise, incurred. So are you really bringing in more net dollars into your organization, or are you just compounding the programmatic, stretch, right? If you're already being pulled in a million different directions, and this doesn't make sense, getting that $10,000 isn't really going to feel like you're getting an extra $10,000 in that example. Okay. If you know that your accounting and financial department is a bit stretched, you've been unsuccessful in tracking restricted grants at any point in the past, and you've not solved a problem for better dealing with the compliance elements, whether it's basic reporting to the funders, whether it's your year-end audit and keeping track of how those dollars were spent and giving the detail to that to your auditors. Maybe for your 990 preparation, it's been a bit of a headache for you to be able to track those restricted grants. If you've had any of these issues, I promise you adding more and more restricted grants to the mix it's just going to further compound the problem. So if you've not found ways to minimize errors or mitigate unnecessary compliance risk, I would not suggest that you continue adding the complexity of restricted grants if your accounting function is already not set up properly to scale with you in that way. Maybe that's a pretty obvious one, and then last but not least, think about your organizational budget. How much is funded by restricted grants and how much is funded by unrestricted grants or dollars, individual giving, what have you. So often I've seen organizations that have a disproportionately high percentage of their funding coming from a very restricted source. And those dollars have to be spent in a very specific way on very specific things. And what that means is that their core operations or maybe their overhead, their staff time, infrastructure, professional development, these other things that are really important to the organization tend to be underfunded. So being really mindful of whether we have the infrastructure to continue supporting restricted grants when there's not additional dollars to support the overhead and the other core operations, the supporting services and things like that of the organization. I know I've worked for an organization before where we kept growing programmatically, grant after grant after grant after grant. And that is great, a reason to celebrate. And we were having a huge impact on the program side and being able to support so many more individuals in the community. Problem with that is those grants did not allow for any additional administrative support. So the problem is we just kept adding more and more and more program growth, which again was great, but we were growing at a faster rate on the programmatic side with no dollars that were going to support administration. And the fundraising department could not keep pace with the gap between maybe what it costs to provide these supports, these services in the program side. So there might be a gap there, compounded by the issue that there's probably administrative overhead that's also not being it's not being addressed or funded. So in these cases, while we think that bringing on restricted grants are actually helping the problem, in some cases it might have the opposite impact. For example, if we know that we're writing a grant that says that we're going to get $20,000 per particular funder, but in order to get that grant, we have to match it by additional $10,000 of our own dollars or something to this effect in order to go do this thing that we weren't doing otherwise. We've just now widened our own fundraising gap and probably created more complexity within the organization that's going to stretch our infrastructure even more. So if your organization is underfunding its operations, we don't have enough administrative support, or we don't have the infrastructure in place to continue supporting programmatic growth really driven by restricted grants, we might want to just hit pause and think about whether these restricted grants make sense. So this is where it gets to the point where, so I gave a lot of foundational stuff, some of the stuff you all might already know. And this really gets to the meat of what I was hoping to talk about in this episode. Why should you release restricted grants as soon as possible? And this conversation came up with the client just recently where they had a restricted grant for an event. And they spent over $1 million on this event. It's a, conference they do every single year. And they had sponsorships, right? The sponsorships, I don't know, were about $250,000, right? And in their minds, they wanted to hold on to some of those sponsorships and apply them to the conference in the subsequent year. And it was in their mind a way of just saving the dollars, even though the monies received were restricted for a particular event that had already taken place. And I had to walk this client through kind of the idea of how problematic that could be long term. In other words, why would you not want to release the restrictions on these dollars that you received and say, look, donor, I've spent them in accordance to how you want them to be spent. Everything is good and great. The reality is sometimes when we get restricted dollars, it just goes into the full pool of dollars that we have, unrestricted, restricted. It all goes into one pool of money, right? And then we pay our bills out of that. And when we have to track these dollars and we have to release these dollars, a lot of times it's really just on a spreadsheet to essentially prove, hey, you gave me $100,000. I said I was going to spend $100,000 on these things. This is evidence to suggest that we incurred expenses and paid out of our checking account $100,000 in accordance with our grant agreement, right? I think so many times people think about restricted grants as like they have their own individual bank accounts and we only spend out of those bank accounts. But the reality is it's all married together. So when accountants are charged by the auditors and funders, they're simply needing to prove and give evidence that these restrictions were met. But so many times I meet leaders of nonprofits that think of it more of a savings mechanism, like literal dollars in a bank account and a savings mechanism. And I had to go through this exercise with a client, like I said, to really map out the consequences of not releasing those dollars as soon as we can and to break away from this concept of saving for future events, for example. And one of the things that I shared with the particular client of ours was that if you have a donor or a funder that's giving you dollars for a specific purpose, especially if it's a time or programmatic purpose, by extending that period greater than what they originally thought you needed the dollars, I would argue that maybe that demonstrates some level of, or it doesn't demonstrate that you have a need potentially for those dollars. So is this going to create a problem for you next time you go back to that funder and say, hey, I really need $100,000 for my event? And they might say, well, you didn't actually spend it last time, so maybe we'll only give you 50 this time. And I think that restricted grants are going to become more and more problematic for nonprofit organizations and philanthropy as a whole. I think we all know that grants are becoming tricky and funding as a whole is becoming very challenging for organizations. I've already seen a shift with some philanthropic partners that are shifting away from some of the organizations that they've historically funded and prioritizing organizations that maybe recently have lost federal funding or state funding, depending on the program or what's going on there, right? So the philanthropic community, I have seen a trend of shifting its gears and prioritizing organizations that maybe have lost funding. So if you're not demonstrating a need to your funders and showing them why their dollars are really important to your initiative, your program, your event, whatever it might be, I think that's doing your organization a disservice. The reality is, in this particular case, my client had spent over $1 million. Okay. We only had $250,000 of restricted gifts. We more than can demonstrate the fact that we need those dollars to make this program successful, right? So I had to really walk through with the client on that. The second thing that I had to explain to this particular client was the fact that, when it comes down to restricted grants, truly from a contractual obligation standpoint, the auditors look at what that contract says, and they want to verify you released those dollars in accordance with whatever that contract says. And if for some reason, if you are successful in saying, hey, this donor gave me $100,000 for this particular program, I could theoretically release it this year, but I'm going to save it for next year. Technically, I think you could do that if there's no timing restrictions on it. And your auditors would probably sign off on it because there's no timing restrictions. As long as you spend it on the program, whether it's this year or next year, usually it's not a problem. But what I've seen sometimes happen when people carry over these restrictions when they don't necessarily need to, it can be problematic potentially to release them in the future. Maybe your program shifts for some reason. Maybe you end up not spending dollars for a particular reason. And if you carry these restricted funds forward year after year as a means to save or to hold on to these funds to apply towards future years, the reality is you might be doing yourself a disservice by making it harder and harder for you to release those dollars at some other point in the future. And I've seen that happen with organizations sometimes too. So the reality is if you don't release those funds straight away, they sit on your balance sheet as what we call like a restricted net asset. In some ways, people might think of it as deferred revenue or just a kind of a pot of money that we've basically earmarked for some point in the future, we're going to spend that. It creates sometimes a false sense of security, like, oh, we have all these net assets, things are great. But the reality is, can we release them? Are they going to be problematic? Are they going to be tied up in the future? And it's going to be harder and harder to spend those dollars. It's hard to say. And I just like to feel like a practical tip is to release those dollars as quickly as possible. Make all the cash in your bank account as unrestricted as possible, because I think if anything the world has taught us in the last, I don't know, year, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, that everything is all up in the air. Things are changing so quickly. And I think it's really, really important for nonprofits to continue to be flexible and nimble. And what that typically means is to keep those dollars as unrestricted as possible, no strings attached. So if you and your board need to pivot, that's the easiest way to do it. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about with restricted funds, why they might hurt you, why they might help you. And if you are new to potentially writing restricted grants, think about some of the things that we talked about today and see, does this make sense for your organization? Ultimately, if you already have restricted grants, do an inventory and say how much of these are still lingering? How much do we have left on each particular grant? Are we at risk for not spending them? Are we having a hard time tracking them? Are we able to do the reporting that we want? Is this really scalable? And the reality is there are ways to create a grant reporting system that is scalable. We do it all the time for our 200 plus clients all the time. I will also say another practical tip is always advocate for unrestricted support to the degree possible. So many times I've seen fundraising professionals pitch an idea to a funder that restricts dollars when maybe it's an informal conversation and get the donor excited about what could be possible, but we don't necessarily have to formally restrict those dollars and tie them up into a particular initiative if at some point maybe the organization shifts directions. And last but not least, work really closely with your finance team to make sure that whatever dollars that you have are being appropriately tracked, are restricted, and allows the releases of those cash dollars to be made available for whatever comes through your bank account next. I hope all this was super helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Go to our website. We have tons of free resources and other templates that might make it easier for you to do some of your accounting and financial work. If you found this insightful, like I always do, shameless plug, interact with this content in some way to make topics like this more searchable for people trying to find answers to questions that we ponder, like restricted grants. See you next time. Bye, everybody.